what you're working on. That is great. Can you help me set it up so that they can see my PowerPoint and I can still see my notes? I think if I do. Are you the designated tech person?
I guess so.
All I know is that it's not me. I'm not the designated tech person.
And then, is this you?
There we go. Okay,
And then
so
you can do,
then if you do,
I think, there's a slideshow here. Oh, it's easier on the phone. Is there like a, I don't know, who's presented to you? Is that good?
yeah, that's perfect.
Awesome.
I'm going to have you do that again because I'm actually merging two different presentations.
Okay,
They're
yeah,
doing
totally.
two different things.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And I'm going to slide this over here so I can see it and I can see you at the same time. A little background about me. You maybe heard that I'm the legislative and political director at Sierra Club North Star Chapter. Sierra Club is a national organization. We have state chapters. Our state chapter is called the North Star Chapter. Little background about me. My father's family is from West Central Minnesota. I grew up in Minneapolis, went to college in Northfield. My wife and I live with our daughters about 15 minutes from here. They're 9 and 6, which means I've entered the double chauffeur phase of life. I was just told by one of the older parents, now that the younger one is doing soccer, that's what I'm in, double chauffeur for the next 12 years or whatever. I had a transformative thing happen to me in my life when I was close to your age. I was a junior. And when I was a junior, I got to visit Cancer Alley in Louisiana. Anybody know about Cancer Alley? Raise your hand if you've heard of this. Okay, a lot of you have. Great. Tight concentration of three things: polluting petrochemical facilities, people of color, and lots of cancers and many other health impacts. I had written a paper on environmental racism, and I ended up guest teaching about environmental justice to a high school class in New Orleans. I want to be clear, I was definitely not the most qualified person to teach on this topic. Dr. Robert Bullard had published his landmark book, Dumping in Dixie, Dixie referring to the American South, the year before, but he wasn't available to teach in my brother's junior high school class. I was. As it happens, my paper was sent by my professor to his former colleague, United States Senator Paul Wellstone, then in his second year in office. And Wellstone, according to my professor, used my paper to help him advocate for the creation of the Office of Environmental Justice at the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, I am not under any kind of illusion that my paper was like some kind of the instrumental thing for that office or for Wellstone. But just the idea that that was possible, that somebody could get the right words, the right ideas, the right stats to the right person to make a real difference in people's lives, I was down for that mission from that point forward. I had already been hooked on political change through elections, through my mother, who was a legislator starting from the time I was 15 and for the next 34 years. But understanding the political side, the campaign side of things, and the policy side of things started to coalesce for me around my junior year of college. I went on to work in educational theater and on many, many political campaigns. I worked for the state Senate for a few years, and then for over a decade at the city of Minneapolis, especially on city budgets and urban environmental policy, especially transportation and land use. Was a stay-at-home dad for a couple of years, and I've been at Sierra Club now for 4 years. Part of what inspired me coming to the city of Minneapolis around the turn of the century was this map. It wasn't long before I started the city of Minneapolis that people first documented that where people live makes a huge impact on how much they contribute to the climate crisis. People living in denser areas pollute a lot less per capita than people who don't. This was a revolutionary thought at the time. It isn't any longer, at least for people paying attention. But at the time, there was the Senate thinking that, well, where is the pollution coming from? Well, people pollute, so people are a problem. Well, but then you ask the important question, how much do people pollute per capita? And you get literally the opposite picture. You realize that the central cities are some of the least polluting places because of inherent efficiencies of people living closer together. It's actually a long list of factors: driving distances, access to transit, walkability, heating and cooling efficiencies of multifamily housing, greater carbon intensity of building more infrastructure to connect people who are further apart from one another out in the suburbs. This obviously is the Chicago area, not Minneapolis. But since then, this phenomenon has been documented everywhere. Last December, the New York Times decided to make it really easy for everyone. You could just look up where you live, put your zip code in, and you can find out, including in the Twin Cities. And frankly, it's the same story everywhere because those same factors apply everywhere. There's no judgment in asking where you live. It's not about putting guilt on anybody. It's a data point about where do we want more people to live as we move forward. By the way, what they quantified at the turn of the century was a challenge, I think, to typical environmental thinking back then, which assumed, and some people still assume, that Henry David Thoreau's house in the woods at Walden Pond is the environmental ideal. Worse, the environmental movement was historically anti-urban. Frankly, it was anti-people of color, and Sierra Club has had to wrestle with the history of its founding and its founder in that regard. But today, knowing what we know now, to address the climate crisis, we must recognize that environmentalism in housing looks more like this. And this. And this. And this. Next door in Minneapolis along the Midtown Greenway. Dense housing, efficient to build and to heat and to cool, and located to facilitate choices for how to get around by walking or biking, and by bus and by train. And in the future, by electric and driverless buses. So thanks to what they quantified in Chicago, I went to City Hall in 2002 knowing that the answer to the climate crisis must include welcoming more people to live in cities. When I was a kid, people have been talking about the death of cities. Cities have been shrinking in populations for decades. When I started in the city of Minneapolis, particularly for older cities, it was just math. Average household size in 1950 was 3.51. I got behind my slides, 3.51, and it decreased drastically to 2.6. So here's this population of the city of Minneapolis. It peaked at 520,000, dropped as far as 368. That's a huge drop. It has now rebounded to 429 and is still rising. That's good for the climate, because we know if they don't live in Minneapolis, if they don't live in St. Paul, if they don't live in the other 11 core suburbs that increased in population and then decreased, where else are they going to live? At the periphery of the region, destroying green space, destroying farmland to build new, super inefficient, transit inaccessible housing. So I shared this. I'll just end on the success story. After 10 years at City Hall working on projects like Green Line LRT, the arterial bus line on Snelling, which does intersect with Minneapolis, so Minneapolis got to play a part in that. We actually joined a very small group of cities where we've simultaneously increased population while decreasing vehicle miles traveled. That was something people didn't. I saw your reaction. Those people didn't think that was. You can't do that. People equals pollution, right? Well, yes, but to drastically different degrees depending on where they live. So I'm going to stop there in terms of this slideshow, and I'm going to flip to another one because I don't want to go down just deep into my own transportation world. I want to go big picture.
Yes. A little distracting. Totally.
Yeah, so if we hit escape there, and we're going to go to, you are going to be the second people to ever see this presentation that I made. It's a brand new one. Now here we can do the same thing.
Yeah. I'm more
So
familiar.
while he's putting this together, Sierra Club and two of our partner organizations were invited by 4 legislators to ultimately present to state representatives in Minnesota to ultimately present to 24 legislators in the State House about real versus fake climate solutions. I was so excited to get this offer, and my colleague Sarah Wolf at Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light and Jason Hill, a professor at the University of Minnesota, we had brought this up to them like 2 years before. We didn't know if they were interested still, because the first session where they had this Democratic trifecta where they were passing all these big bills, maybe they thought it wasn't relevant anymore. Oh my God, that wasn't true at all. It was totally relevant. They were too busy passing big bills, which I will tell you about in a moment, to think about playing defense on bad ideas. 2 weeks after the session ended, they reached out to Sarah and I and said, can you do that presentation we talked about a year ago about real versus fake climate solutions? Because our younger colleagues are getting inundated. By the way, some of their younger colleagues are not that much older than you, by the way. The legislature has drastically changed in a great way. They said some of our younger colleagues, they're getting pitched by these people who say, green this and green that, and we're super skeptical of some of these ideas, and we want you to help us analyze them together. And we said to these legislators, we'll do better than that. We're not just going to tell you what's real and what's fake. We're going to set up a rubric, a set of questions you can ask so you can figure out on your own what's real and what's fake. And by the way, we will give you some examples of things that are like right now. So we did this presentation for them a couple of weeks ago, and now I get to share this with you, but I can't see my speaker's notes. How does that?
The right arrow.
Perfect. There we go. Okay. So the House Climate Caucus invited us, and I'm just going to tell you what we're going to cover. Introduction to Examining Climate Solutions series. I'm going to start with some good news that'll take about 5-6 minutes. And then I'm going to share with you what I was just talking about. 5 key questions you can use to evaluate something somebody is telling you is a climate solution. And then you can figure out whether it really is or not. We also applied those 5 questions to something you hear about a lot in the Midwest and you don't hear a lot about elsewhere, which is ethanol. Is ethanol a climate solution? No. Because that presentation was 90 minutes, I'm going to skip a lot of the ethanol specific material. Because for what I think is maybe useful for you and for us to discuss is those 5 key questions for evaluating climate solutions. So that's what we're going to do for the next 20, 25 minutes. And then I'll break for questions along the way here. Okay. There's a couple of obvious places to break for questions. Okay. So let me start with the good news. It is human nature, I think, to want a simple solution to a complex problem. We know, and together we all, and I do include you in this, not just the legislators, we can help Minnesotans understand there is no one solution, no single policy, no single technology to address the climate crisis. However, and the reason there isn't one is because we produce climate from multiple sectors: surface transportation, agriculture, aviation, electricity, buildings, etc. But while there is no single solution or single policy solution, there is a linchpin to forward progress, a linchpin to eliminating climate pollution from multiple sectors of the economy, which is having and expanding a clean source of power, namely electricity. So it was a really big deal. Oh my God, I've wanted this for years. It was a big deal last year when the legislature passed early in session, not even at the end of session. They passed it before Valentine's Day. Sessions start in January and they go through May. And before Valentine's Day, they passed the 100% bill, which requires electric utilities to transition to 100% carbon-free electricity. 11 states require this transition by 2050 or earlier. Minnesota is requiring it by 2040, which puts us like in the top 5 of this club. You'll notice this club includes some big states: California, Illinois, New York. We're the first state in the upper Midwest, and I'm so relieved that we've done this. Independent climate experts confirm how essential this is. Oops, there we go. Dr. Leah Stokes, one of my favorites, who worked on the Federal Inflation Reduction Act, you've talked about the Inflation Reduction Act, I'm sure, said, moving to 100% renewable energy as fast as possible, electrifying everything we can. If we do those 2 things alone, it can cut 3/4 of current carbon pollution. Climate change she continued beyond up here. Climate change can feel really overwhelming. There's all these different pollutants. They come from so many different sectors, but it really just boils down to clean electricity plus electrification for the vast majority of the solution. Many others who worked on the Inflation Reduction Act, including Princeton professor Jesse Jenkins of the Zero Lab, have said the same thing. More good news, neither technology nor economics are the impediment to that clean electric future. Quite the opposite. The costs of these key technologies we need, solar, wind, energy storage, have been falling far more and far faster than even the most optimistic projections from 2010. We have no reason to believe those costs have stopped dropping. We have every reason to believe that they will keep dropping based on really great studies of the cost curves of these types of technologies. This study from Oxford University says, and this is really good news, the transition using these technologies is going to save us money in purely economic terms before factoring in avoided costs related to the climate and public health. And the faster we go, the more we save. This is terrible news for fossil fuel executives. To learn after all this time that they are the drag on our economy means they really have no factual arguments left. Of course, long-term economics have always been on our side. They've always been on the side of climate action because the economic cost of inaction is so incalculable. But now all the economics are on our side. As one of the co-authors of this Oxford study said, the minus sign is now a plus sign. So don't let people, if you see even friends of ours who are just out of date, say, well, there are costs, but cut them off, stop them. There are benefits and. This is why global clean energy capital is rushing to the United States since the IRA passed. It is the reason that nations and states that don't move quickly towards zero emissions future, they are the ones who will be putting themselves at a dangerous competitive disadvantage. So let's talk about the goal. The goal we are heading towards is often called net zero. But the goal of net zero itself has real and fake versions. Maybe you've talked about this already. Net zero, what is net zero? Net zero is the point where the amount of emissions being added to the atmosphere is equal to the amount of emissions we are removing from the atmosphere. I want to be clear in expressing what I'm about to express. I'm not arguing for or against using the words net zero, but we do need to recognize its limitations. Scientists and advocates have appreciated using the net zero frame for the right reasons, because net zero reminds us that we not only need to stop climate emissions by shifting to things that don't pollute, we also need to preserve natural spaces that sequester carbon in plants and in soils. The Amazon rainforest there on the right, of course, is the most obvious worldwide example, but also wild spaces all over the world, including the super carbon dense lowland forests and peatlands here in northern Minnesota. This is our rainforest, just a few hours drive from here. Unfortunately, many polluting industries also like the net zero frame for all the wrong reasons. They want net zero to mean that they can keep right on burning fossil fuels and it will somehow be offset by industrial sequestration some other way. For example, if they buy cheap carbon credits, which have been repeatedly exposed as scams. Or maybe they will emit somewhat less carbon over time, perhaps even with investing more money in fossil fuel polluting systems, paired with carbon capture technologies that are at best extremely expensive, unscalable, and never actually capture all the carbon. There are a few exceptions to that, and you can ask me about those, and I'd be happy to talk about them. Case in point, this happened like 3 days before we talked to the legislators. As reported on NPR in early September, Occidental Petroleum actually claimed that thanks to industrial carbon capture, again, not yet online, it will someday produce net zero oil. So there's, quote, no reason not to produce oil and gas forever. But of course, these failed carbon capture schemes have succeeded in one and only one way. They help to construct an impossible but politically convenient version of net zero. So we've described what net zero, real net zero is. And as described again by Dr. Leah Stokes and Jesse Jenkins, it is mostly electrification. For most of the sectors of the economy, net zero looks like zero. Physicist Joe Romm, who did that wonderful compilation recently talking about all the carbon credit schemes and how they all had common flaws. He said, there is no net zero. There is only zero. There is no free lunch. I'm not going to be quite as categorical as Joe Rahm is, but I would say, if you go sector by sector, net zero is zero from emissions from electricity. It is zero emissions from surface transportation. And yes, it's politically or logistically more difficult, but we need to get to net zero from buildings. We need to get to, zero from buildings and zero from agriculture. We have the technologies to do that. Some sectors are legitimately harder technologically, not just politically. It's genuinely really hard to decarbonize steel and cement production, for example, with existing technologies. They will need a longer runway. Maybe there's an application there for some industrial carbon capture in an interim condition. So to the extent that we need carbon sequestration, natural or otherwise, it's mostly going to be needed to offset heavy industry, not the sectors above, electricity, transportation, et cetera. Knowing that some sectors are harder than others, we should be moving forward in all sectors, but racing forward in the sectors where we can scale up quickly and the path ahead is so clear and the benefits so overwhelming. So here's the bottom line, and we're going to take questions, I think, after this slide. To stabilize the climate at any higher temperature, we need to stop polluting in multiple sectors, not just pollute less, not delay by investing in more bridge fuels. IPCC goals require reducing 45% by 2030 while getting on a trajectory to zero by 2050. We can meet these goals as long as we direct our energy, time, money, and our window of opportunity to real solutions. But we have to avoid things that will impede progress and or make the climate crisis worse. Let me pause here before we dive into the 5 questions.
I was actually just going to reframe, so I didn't do the greatest job with the introduction. I just wanted to give credit to the Hamlin Environmental Education Project, which all these students have been involved in, has been just doing a lot of investigation and education around.
So I'm telling them so far everything they already know?
No, I think I partly just wanted to say these are people who are like an awesome coefficient for this because they're so interested and are also really invested in educating folks around it. So I kind of wanted to frame questions that way. And then Olivia and Mariah and the crew they represent have really been trying to bring a very interdisciplinary environmental justice lens around campus for the last year.
Awesome.
Going into a second year. So I just kind of wanted to give you more of a sense of the frame of reference that we're bringing. So we're thrilled to hear your synthesis of this.
That's really helpful because I would appreciate, not just encourage, but appreciate taking 2 lenses to this. The direct substantive lens, like what is Peter saying, but also kind of why is Peter using this framework to talk to legislators? Think about that. Think about their jobs. Think about who they talk to, because me and my colleagues, we started out with 20 questions. Then we boiled it down to 8, and then we got it down to 5, and we were trying to, and we debated between ourselves the order of the 5, which you'll hear in just a second. And it's a very deliberate order that we chose for very deliberate reasons. And we also, and I'll just pull back the curtain, on the Wizard of Oz here a little bit, or the several wizards who participated in this. I have concluded at least, that we never start with the 5 questions. We always start with the upbeat summary of what we can do in the real version of net zero. So, but you should push back and you should challenge this. Again, we're taking this on the road now. We went to Broadway. We're in Connecticut now. We're bringing the show around. But a lot of debate and interaction with the committee chairs went into this sequencing. So feel free to ask me questions on that level as well. Other questions before we dive into the 5?
There is a question in the chat. Do heavy industries have technologies to be able to switch, or is there a gap there?
Boy, that's a great question. And since you asked it now, I'm going to answer it now. I think the most hopeful thing to come online, the hopeful future for things like steel and cement is we will get to the point in 10 or 15 years where we will have really robust production of clean electricity and a really great electric grid all around the country. So there will be times when we will have electricity for which there is no demand, because, you know, electricity by definition, sometimes the wind isn't shining, sometimes the sun isn't shining, sometimes the wind isn't blowing. And when we have a really robust grid, we're going to be able to spread the electricity around, but there is going to be electricity that would otherwise be wasted. If that electricity can be used in electrolysis to produce truly green hydrogen, and you also be super, super skeptical of existing hydrogen. Existing hydrogen is incredibly polluting because it comes from fossil gases. But in the future, if it's coming from excess electricity produced in a green process and stored as hydrogen, that can be used as a really dense form of energy to produce the heat that is needed, the energy that is needed for steel and cement on demand. So I think there's a future for that. But frankly, you're kind of asking like the 501 question as I'm starting at 101, because when we talk to the legislators, we are deliberately having the last session of the 5 sessions we're hoping to have be about hydrogen. Because it's one of those things where the people who are pitching it right now are pitching it for all the wrong reasons. And yet we can't deny that it does need to be a part of the future conversation. But whether or not hydrogen is good or bad depends crucially on what is it produced from and what is it used for. When people say we're going to put hydrogen in people's cars or to heat people's homes, that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. That's meant to perpetuate fossil fuel burning systems. So you asked me like the most complicated one, and the legislators are going to get that in session 5 in January.
How does like policies like carbon taxes and the cap and trade system play into this conversation?
That's a great question. Is it okay if I pause on that one?
Yeah.
I will give you a brief preview. So the simplest way.
Logistical. People in chat are asking because the microphone is near you if you could repeat the audience questions.
Of course.
Before you answer them.
Absolutely. Okay, so the question is, where does carbon taxes fit into carbon taxes and what was
Cap and trade.
and cap and trade? Okay, so let me start with carbon taxes, just as to use the simpler of the two. Cap and trade is more complicated. If you want to be really simplistic in categorizing legislation on climate, there's carrots and there's sticks. Incentivizing the good or whacking down the bad. Carbon taxes, in and of themselves, are knocking down the bad. Now, you could use carbon tax as the revenue to also invest in clean energy. And there were big differences between the left-wing and right-wing proposals for carbon taxes. But when we get to the end, I'd like to talk about the politics of carrots versus sticks, because you all know, and if you don't, I'm going to tell you now, the Inflation Reduction Act is overwhelmingly carrots, and there are very few sticks. And we do need more sticks. As a matter of fact, our senator, Tina Smith, was leading the Clean Power Plan, which would have had sticks. And Joe Manchin didn't want it, and we didn't think the Supreme Court wanted it. Do we ultimately need that? No question. But I think the sequence we are now following, to start with carrots and do sticks later, is the sequence we were always going to end up doing because of the politics of one versus the other. Can I whet your appetite with that beginning answer, and then we'll come back to it, because I think it'll make more sense after we get into the 5 questions. We do ultimately have to have both.
Yeah, well, when we have this conversation, I'd love to push back a little on this because I think, carbon tax is more efficient, and markets create all sorts of perverse incentives, as we've seen with RED+.
I totally agree.
But what I wanted to say right now is just to say thank you for pushing back on CCUS. I have a student who's working on carbon capture and storage, and it is incredibly, oil industries want to do it because they've been doing it forever for enhanced oil recovery. And there are training programs popping up everywhere at the UNFCCC COPs. I heard someone say the only way to adjust transition is through carbon capture, use, and storage. So I think it's just a really important thing to be pushing back against. So
And let's come back to both of those, because I actually agree with you about the first point. and we had to measure the impacts and the politics together.
Yeah.
But to your point about carbon capture and sequestration, we're going to get into that. As a matter of fact, I spent an hour and a half today on the phone with some of our allies pushing back against, I think, the biggest example of a Minnesota carbon capture use sequestration scheme, which I want to make sure you know about. But I definitely want to save that for a little bit later, because you should know what's happening right here in our backyard. Is that enough for now? Can I dive into the 5 questions? Okay. Okay. And again, we're going to, this presentation, talk through the 5 questions and apply them specifically to ethanol as an example. I'll do that a little bit, but I'm going to skip a bunch of slides. So here are the 5 questions. Question number 1, what percentage, keyword percentage, of climate-produced pollution is reduced or added by a proposed solution? Number 2, pathways. Can this technology exist in our zero emissions future, or is it a dead-end pathway? Number 3, are there better alternatives for achieving the result this proposed solution would bring? Number 4, what are the other impacts of the proposed solution beyond emissions, both good and bad? Finally, dollars. Who benefits from the solution? Who suffers from it? Who pays for it? We were asked by the chair of the committee to see if we could find a memorable way to put together these. And we don't expect you to memorize any of this. We'll obviously share it all. But Chair Liz Ryer suggested we find a device to help you remember these. So I want you to note that the first 5 letters of the 5 key words, emissions, pathways, alternatives, impacts, and dollars, form the acronym EPAID. EPAID. So let's dive into the 5 questions. Oops. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit of this ethanol-specific content about the history of ethanol. It was not designed to be a climate solution. It's taking up an extraordinary amount, looking at the corner down there, of land mass, corn for grain versus corn for ethanol. It's been increasing. It's basically 2 countries in the world doing all of it, Brazil and the United States. Shouldn't be doing that in Brazil, shouldn't be doing it here.
3 of us just drove to South Dakota, so we went through the ethanol.
You know all this stuff.
It was great.
So I'm going to skip these. Okay, question number 1. What percentage of climate pollution is reduced or added by a solution today? Obviously, if a proposed climate response doesn't reduce emissions, it's not real. Since we have to get to zero, anything that produces emissions, more emissions, is not a climate solution, it's a climate problem. And we believe that to be the case with ethanol. But just in general, in order to figure this out, you need to do a life cycle assessment. And the life cycle assessment should include everything. Life cycle includes a total carbon impact from raw resource extraction to processing, manufacturing, operations, maintenance, disposal. You should always consider the source of the study and put numbers in the context of a bigger picture. This is why I use the word percentage in particular. My mother, when she was in the legislature, had somebody from the administration talking to her about a particular pot of money to improve the energy efficiency of a set of low-income housing, and they described how they were doing in financial terms. They might have used one of these terms like, this is the equivalent of taking X number of cars off the road. And my mother asked the question, but what percentage of homes are you going to address? Like, how long is it going to take to get to zero based on your current proposed funding? And they were forced to answer. The question was like 258 years or something like that. And she said, well, that's the metric. The metric is how far are you going towards zero? So that's the value of percentages being used because it helps to focus on a goal. I'm going to skip some of these ethanol slides because Scully's study was ridiculous. The bottom line here is when you factor in land use, ethanol is worse than just using gasoline in the first place. When you consider all the things that go into it, 24% worse according to the University of Wisconsin study. So number 2, key question number 2. I'm going to skip past number 1 because I think that's pretty straightforward. Is it going up or going down? This is the more complicated one. Can this technology exist in our zero emissions future, or is it a dead-end pathway? We know that to stabilize the climate, we must get on a path to zero. Some shifts, like moving from coal to natural gas, have reduced emissions comparatively from where we were, but we also know they cannot get us to where we need to go. So new investments in new fossil gas infrastructure, or ethanol, which are often described as bridge fuels, it's more accurate to describe them as dead-end pathways. What are dead-end pathways? Well, I remember doing a little math in my head. There might be only 3 of us who remember when the 35W bridge collapsed into the Mississippi. Do any of the students here remember that? Okay, I'm getting a little bit. 35W in downtown Minneapolis crashed into the Mississippi. And a lot of state leaders and the President of the United States who came here and stood on the wreckage of the bridge were asking, how do we do something this big, rebuild a bridge and do it really fast? Well, imagine for a moment, a builder, a potential contractor had said, well, my bridge design can be built fastest and cheapest. There's just only one catch. My bridge design only goes halfway across the river and stops. Well, we would obviously never invest money in that. That's not a bridge. That's like the most expensive viewing platform ever built. Well, IPC scientists confirm we need to get to net zero by 2050. Getting to zero by 2050 is the climate equivalent of getting to the other side of the river. So it's not enough for the technologies we invest in to have a path to somewhat reduce emissions. It's not enough to be cleaner than coal or even cleaner in general, which all the polluters love to say at the Capitol, it's cleaner without a percentage. This is why you increasingly hear the phrase electrify everything or electrify everything we can to describe our path forward, because investing in electric air source heat pumps, electric water heaters, electric stoves, electric buses, these are not just better because they pollute less today, they also have a path to zero. By contrast, a new coal plant does not have a path to zero, neither does a new fossil gas plant, neither does a gas pipeline, neither does any new household appliance that uses fossil gas or any internal combustion engine in a car. These are all dead-end pathways. They have no path to zero. Pursuing dead-end pathways can both divert precious dollars, research, and capacity from real solutions while compounding the climate problem. So ask the question, does the proposed climate response invest in and therefore extend the economic life of technologies that burn fossil fuels? Coming back to ethanol for an example, and I will share just this example with you, the Governor's Council on Biofuels recommended investing nearly $800 million to upgrade gas stations to handle a higher percentage ethanol blend. Instead of 10% ethanol, 15% ethanol, or maybe 20% ethanol. But of course, the rest of it is still gasoline. Even if you did believe that ethanol was better, if I pour a drop of diesel into a glass of champagne, I'm not going to drink it. So is investing in gas stations to handle a slightly higher ethanol blend, is that an upgrade to invest in? Even if ethanol had the 15% that is ethanol had the benefits they claim, and it doesn't, the other 85% is still gasoline, which we need to stop using. Gasoline sold by Exxon, ConocoPhillips, Chevron, Shell, Texaco, BP, should we invest in their infrastructure, help them make more money from Minnesotans? At least a bridge that only goes halfway across the river is just useless. Money spent to upgrade gas stations is literally taking us backwards, because we also have to not forget about the opportunity costs. Any of you who's taken Econ 101 knows we should be asking, well, how much positive impact could we have on climate by investing $800 million in something else? Perhaps like electrification. Which brings us to question number 3. Are there better alternatives? But I'm going to pause here because I want to make sure. So we talked about question 1, how much does it reduce pollution today? And question number 2, does it have a path to zero? Thoughts on this, or do you want me to keep going? I'm getting a thumbs up to keep going. Okay, we're going to get into the more justice stuff in a moment here. Alternatives. Are there better alternatives? Well, as it relates to ethanol, my God, yes. Even if you believe that ethanol made sense at one point in time, it is now clearly out of date. It has been left behind by technological advancement. EVs are already significantly less polluting today for 2 primary reasons. One you know and one you may not know. First of all, the far greater efficiency of electric motors compared to internal combustion engines. According to the US Department of Energy, EVs convert 77% of the electrical energy from the grid to power at the wheels. That's what you want to go. You want forward motion. Conventional gasoline vehicles only convert 12 to 30% of the energy stored in gasoline to power at the wheels. And of course, the second reason is the current electricity supply, which is already greener due to the expanded use of renewable energy like solar and wind. This existing advantage of EVs will only grow as the electric grid continues to improve, especially in Minnesota, thanks to the 100% bill. Now, those threatened by electrification regularly throw out issues that were already factored into independent life cycle assessments. They throw them out as if nobody had ever thought of them before. Maybe you saw this summer, Rowan Atkinson, Mr. Bean, a car enthusiast, shared his supposed electric expertise along with a debunked study from a car company, noting that the production of EVs is more carbon intensive than the production of a gas car. Yes, thank you. We all knew that. It's factored in. I won't bore you with the details, but just know this. When you drive a gas car, you need to refill it constantly with newly extracted and newly refined gasoline. There's no comparison to an electric vehicle. Nobody drives an electric vehicle to a station and says, fill her up with a fresh tank of lithium. That's not how it works. Unlike gas, the lithium is mined once. Of course, it's not just EVs. Can we reach zero in transportation with electrification alone? No. We cannot, and we'll come back to that later. But there is no path to zero without rapidly switching from gas cars to EVs. This is not to say there's no potential role for newer biofuels, obviously something better than ethanol, but it should be focused towards heavier vehicles, construction equipment, or aviation, where no superior electric alternative already exists. Now I'm going to get into impacts, but I want to stop again. Talked about alternatives. I said the justice thing was in number 3. It's in number 4.
So EVs.
Yeah.
Like you're talking about how like you don't want solutions that are going to perpetuate infrastructure. EVs kind of perpetuate car infrastructure and they're not accessible to all people right now.
Yep.
So would like public transit, electrified public transit, be a better alternative, and are EVs maybe distracting from the main issue?
The answer is yes,
Okay.
absolutely. And I kind of left it behind in my previous presentation. We'll switch to this one. And I get to it later in this presentation, and we have a rubric for that. The balance there is that we have been investing in car-dependent infrastructure and urban planning for so long that there's just vast sections of the country where transit is not yet a viable option. And the good news is, and I'm going to come back to what the legislature did at the end here, is the legislature knows what you know. Let me rephrase that. The 2 transportation chairs and a lot of members of the House and the Senate know what you know. But there are plenty of people who don't know. And they think, literally the number of people who think electrification is the answer is like the single biggest problem amongst people of good faith within this space. I'll suggest a rubric which answers your question more specifically, but you're absolutely right. I'm going to dive into the 4th question because I want to make sure we have time to get to this one. Okay, our 4th question asks us to look at the other impacts of any possible climate solution. Are there harmful effects on people? Which groups will experience that harm and have been experiencing that harm? Does the solution require damaging infrastructure that harms ecosystems, surface waters, or aquifers? Does the solution add air pollution? There's a whole long list I couldn't possibly include of all the ways we should ask questions about impacts. This is a good spot to stop and reflect on the fact that we have been naming the climate crisis, but we are collectively facing 3 interconnected environmental emergencies around the globe: the climate crisis, the destruction of ecosystems and accompanying biodiversity loss, and pollution. These are dynamic systems that inform and feed each other. The climate crisis is driven by pollution from fossil fuels and also adds to the destruction of forests. Habitat is diminishing because it is being cleared for agriculture or pipelines or development, which is driving the species extinction and polluting waters while at the same time releasing carbon. Plastics pollution is impacting wildlife. At the same time, they face stressors from increasing heat and wildfires. The loss of biodiversity is impacting our water's ability to purify itself. People cause these problems, people can solve these problems, but we have to be asking the right questions about these interconnecting problems. I'm going to skip over some of these ethanol slides. The Minnesota Impaired Waters List is updated every 2 years. It's really scary for a state that describes itself as the land of lakes. It is appropriate to ask questions, as you just did, about the side effects of green alternatives. As we do that, we must also re-ask the same questions of the status quo. Here's an example of what happens when we fail to do this. President Trump and others like to note with alarm that wind turbines kill birds, and they do. But of course, burning fossil fuels kills many more birds and whole ecosystems all around the world. Do we discuss the impact of mining for EVs? Yes, we absolutely do. The lithium mining and the other metals involved. But should we not talk about the much larger impact of mining for fossil fuels, sometimes estimated to be over 520 times more? We've noticed, I said this to the legislators, we've noticed that many of your legislative colleagues are suddenly very concerned about human rights in cobalt mining. It's not that they shouldn't be, but Dr. Bullard has been documenting environmental racism from disproportionate burning of petrochemicals on communities of color all over the world, all over the nation since the 1980s. Cancer Alley in Louisiana is one example among hundreds. If we're serious about impacts, we would be discussing all of it, proportionate to its impact. There are often legitimate questions that need to be asked about new technologies, but at the Capitol, what you see is bad faith purity trolling, which almost always ignores the far greater impact of burning fossil fuels. Here's the key. The observations we are making are comparative. We measure the negative effects of the new technologies compared to the fossil fuels technologies. We're not saying there are no polluting effects from solar, wind, batteries, or EVs, but they are far less, and they can be mitigated. I love this study, if you don't know about this one already. The More Mobility, Less Mining study lays out multiple strategies to reduce our need for mining lithium and polluting metals. There are no pure options, but there are much better options. And we can do a lot more to protect the climate, protect water quality, and address environmental justices. This is a partial answer to your question, and there's still one more yet to come. And of course, we should talk about co-benefits. There are many positive side effects. I should stay close to the microphone here. Of moving away from burning fossil fuels. And the key questions include, does it reduce air pollutants? Does it improve water quality? Does it improve soil health? Does it reduce inequality? Does it promote public health? Which groups will experience these benefits? Are these the groups that have been disproportionately harmed in the past? I haven't had a chance to integrate it into this presentation, but I just heard a wonderful presentation. Dr. Marvel, what is her first name? Kate Marvel, was noting that a lot of the changes we're going to make can feel really far off in terms of their direct climate impact. But she was noting that when we reduce air pollution, the impacts show up right away in terms of reduced health impacts, longer lifespan. The numbers come up immediately, and we should be factoring that in. Question number 5 about dollars. Who benefits, who loses, who pays for it? It's always good to ask who benefits financially from any proposed climate response. It's worth noting this is not solely determinative. People also make money from solar and wind. That's good. Healthy skepticism is always warranted when there's a profit motive. We've already asked, does a technology prolong the use of fossil fuels as it relates to big oil? We should also say it applies to big ag, because big ag and big oil both need us to keep investing in internal combustion engines that use both gas and ethanol. Big ag and big oil used to be enemies. They would fight over the 10 or 15% ethanol mandates. But today they are increasingly working together against their common foe, their common foe, which is electric vehicles. And I would add transit. The Koch brothers are always putting money in against any transit campaign. Beyond direct profit motives, and I'm getting a little into the weeds here that you might think only for legislators, but thinking about where you're at in your careers, I want you to know this. It's also good to ask, what is the agenda of the person or organization advocating for a proposed climate response? Here are some questions. Do the state agencies in question have an opposing agenda, or do they have a dual role to promote a particular industry, which constitutes a conflict of interest? I'll name you two. The Department of Agriculture promotes the ethanol industry. It's on their website. That is an opposing agenda. The Department of Natural Resources seeks to promote mining and other timber industries. That's a conflict of interest. This doesn't mean you can't get valuable information from agency staff, but how much you can rely on that info depends on the question you are asking and who's providing the answer. On one end of the spectrum, there's outright regulatory capture. Have you all talked about regulatory capture? Sometimes referred as corporate capture of regulatory agencies. This is when regulating agencies become so sympathetic to the industries they're supposed to regulate that they end up helping those industries at the expense of the public interest. So ask yourself, is there a demonstrated history of regulatory capture? Well, the Minnesota Supreme Court just ruled against the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency on their mining permit for Polymet up north, and the court repeatedly emphasized that MPACA decision-making was arbitrary and capricious. If you know lawyers in the law, that's a slap. Arbitrary and capricious. 5 justices also signed a concurring opinion on treaty rights being violated by the MPCA. So who's the MPCA listening to? The environmental community believes that's an example of regulatory capture. It's also important to note that bad information on climate policy can be unintentional. Are agency staff up to speed on climate change itself? What about rapid technological developments in current research? Are the staff in question even the right staff? Are they being asked to operate outside their expertise? When was the last time they got to attend a conference? Was it an industry conference? Have they met with frontline communities who are affected by the consequences of their decisions? Has expertise on climate been a primary criteria within a state agency for hiring and promotion? If so, since when? Bottom line is, who gets heard? Our experience is that there's often an information gap and or a generation gap amongst agency staff. It's also possible for political appointees to squelch politically inconvenient information. I don't know what you all are going to be doing 2, 3, 5, 10 years from now, but let me tell you, both in the legislature and in the state agencies that I interact with, I have noticed the generation gap. I'm diverting from my script a little bit here. I can't wait for you all to be in not just decision-making roles, but in roles where you can influence decision makers. Because the young people that I see at the Met Council, at the MPCA, they are making a difference. Fighting from within the system, and I've been on both inside and outside, they both make a big difference. Agency staff are often not up to speed for whatever reason. It really helps to get an outside perspective, including some from outside the Midwest. Just to end on ethanol as an example, there's this great climate and energy podcast called Volts. Our majority leader from the State House was on it to talk about the 100% bill and how great it was. The guest was Dan Lashoff from the World Resources Institute to talk about biofuels. And it was like a cleansing bath. It was like after a hot day taking a cold shower, to hear somebody from outside the Midwest be a reality check on the insane conversation that happens at the state capitol when it comes to ethanol. Because the way we talk about it in the Midwest there's no relationship to how it is talked about in the broader world. I'm going to skip a whole ton of slides here. We're going to come back to this one, but I want to end on answering your question in greater detail, which is really close to the end here. Okay. So this seems to be about ethanol, but it's actually not about ethanol. It's actually about an answer to your question. Ethanol is for transportation, right? So we should end the ethanol discussion by summarizing what real climate solutions are in the transportation sector. We talked about electrification already, but let's put it in context, knowing it is necessary but not sufficient. There is, again, no data to support we can hit our climate targets with electrification alone. So Sierra Club is also a member of an organization called the Coalition for Clean Transportation. Includes Minnesota 350 and a number of other organizations. We suggested the following rubric. In the field of solid waste, we prioritize our actions based on the biggest impact, right? You all know the 3 R's. You learned it in school long before you got to Hamlet, right? The 3 R's. So the 3 R's, is that a random list? No, what is it? No. I'm sorry. These 3: reduce, reuse, recycle. Is it a random list, or is it a particular order? Do we say recycle, reduce, reuse?
No, it's reduce, reuse, recycle.
It's reduce, reuse, recycle. It has a specific order to it, which is deliberate. So this is the solid waste list. That which you can reduce, reduce. If you can't reduce it, then you reuse it. If you can't reduce or reuse it, you recycle it. It is a prioritized order. And what the Coalition for Clean Transportation said to the administration when they're coming up with their transportation rubric is, we'll give you the rubric. It's reduce vehicle miles traveled. Electrify those miles that you can't reduce. And for miles you can't reduce or electrify, then you decarbonize through other means other than electrification. Because that is our answer to your question. We actually do need to do all 3. Because of the practical limitations of the fact that we have, a lot of vehicles out there that still have internal combustion engines, and vehicles last for 12 years. So this still matters. And there's a lot of land uses where transit is not a useful tool, although we can change that. But if we are serious, we make our decisions in an ordered priorities way, because we know, based on order of climate impact, by far the least polluting car trip or car miles are the miles you don't need to drive because you have convenient alternatives. Number 2, electricity, as we discussed, is already far superior to any available liquid fuel because of the greater use of solar and wind, like we talked about. And finally, lower carbon liquid fuels in the future should be reserved for vehicles for miles you can't reduce or electrify. I would note that this is a very active debate right now. There are people in the administration who literally have this upside down. But fortunately, and I'm going to come back to the legislative session now, last year we batted 3 for 3. I might even get choked up when I talk about this because it's just like, wow, I have never felt more hopeful as an American that we can do what we need to do to address the climate crisis than when the Inflation Reduction Act passed, right? I mean, I've been at this a long time and I feel a sense of hope beyond the past 30 years. But I have also never been more hopeful as a Minnesotan after last session when we went 3 for 3 on really big climate bills. The idea that Minnesota could do its part to address our emissions, and that is the metric. It is what do we do to address our emissions. The 3 big bills were one we talked about, 100% clean energy, passed before Valentine's Day. The other 2 were the Omnibus Environment Bill, and number 3 was the Omnibus Transportation Bill. The Transportation Bill, designed by Frank Hornstein and Scott Dill, was built basically around this rubric. We passed a 3/4 cent Metro-wide sales tax, which is going to more than double the amount of money we have to build out the transit system. This is actually what I've spent most of my career on at the city of Minneapolis. And I'd be happy to get into that in greater detail, but you guys should start firing more questions at me because we're like functionally at the end here. But so we have money that we didn't have before to build out the transit system. They also included a section, and we're only the 2nd state to have this, about requiring MnDOT, to the Minnesota Department of Transportation, to factor in the climate impact of highways into any future investment decisions. So they have to look at a proposed highway project and compare it to both our GHG, greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals, and our new, we finally have one, vehicle miles traveled, VMT reduction goals. They have to compare it to both And if it isn't going to get us on a trajectory to reduce vehicle miles traveled, to address greenhouse gas emissions, they have to either cancel the project, change the project so that it does address the emissions consistent with our goals, or the VMT, or pair it with other projects where those projects together would have that effect. Colorado did it. We got advice from the Rocky Mountain Institute in Colorado, and we've now done it. And I was just on the phone with somebody in another state who I can't tell you about yet, who's looking to do it next. So there were a bunch of other provisions, commuter rail, heavy rail from here to Duluth is now funded. There's an e-bike credit coming in the next year. There's like a 12% set aside within that sales tax to pay for bicycle infrastructure within the Twin Cities metropolitan area. There's a separate funding for Greater Minnesota Transit. Not as big a carbon impact from that, but very much a justice impact and an equity impact for seniors with mobility problems. And not to mention that the environment bill, and I'm not going to go through all the details, but it includes lots of ways to locally match the federal funding from the IRA for the air source heat pumps and all the kind of things that you can use to electrify your home. So between those three big bills, wow, we are on our way. And we're not done. A big component of reducing VMT is not just transit and biking and electrification. It is also changing our land use patterns so that we are less in the business of destroying agricultural land and green space on the periphery of the region. Our current policies encourage that. We need to turn the dial and start encouraging development within the parts of the region that already have infrastructure, as opposed to destroying land on the periphery, urban sprawl, suburban sprawl, metropolitan sprawl, whatever you call it. Incredibly bad for the climate in multiple ways. And so land use reform is an upcoming topic of the legislature. And now I've talked way too much, and I've only given you like 4 opportunities for questions. So you should start firing them at me or whatever you have time for.
Great. So the land use reform stuff that's happening.
Yeah.
Is it like taking into account like not just people in Minnesota moving into cities, but people who are potentially like migrating here, whether it's a climate related migration or not, like people moving to the cities as like outside of Minnesota?
That's a great question. Within the context of, I don't assume that we'll be talking about it in that frame, but let's explore that question for a moment. Who knows about the Minneapolis 2040 plan? Have you talked about this at all? City of Minneapolis passed a plan which encouraged a greater amount of urban density. And actually, before we do that, let's do this in a linear way. We all know that climate change is real. That's like point number 1. We also know that metropolitan sprawl is really bad if we destroy agricultural land and green space at the periphery of the region. But, and I think your question goes to this point, it's not enough to recognize those two things. It's not enough to say, yes, climate change is real, and yes, metropolitan sprawl is bad. If we say that people shouldn't be moving to the periphery of the region and our population is growing, we have to accommodate them somewhere. And this is where we start to lose people. They want to say, yes, climate change is real. And they want to say, yes, we should stop urban sprawl. And then we say, so that means we need to accommodate more people in places where we already have infrastructure, like the city of Minneapolis. And then some people say, no. It's like, well, this is an irreconcilable thing. If you say we don't want more people in Minneapolis or St. Paul or the 11, 12, 13 suburbs that had a higher population than it dropped down, those people don't cease to exist when you say they can't live here. And this is the fundamental debate at the heart of a lawsuit, which was just in the paper last week, and why there was literally a reporter from a national publication who interviewed me for an hour and a half on Sunday about this question. Because the 2040 plan from the city, which encouraged greater housing density along transit corridors, it legalized 8 and 16 unit apartment buildings in the city for the first time in decades. It also allowed for homes to become duplexes and triplexes, to have granny flats. That one, the smallest impact, actually had the most opposition, strangely enough. It wasn't, I mean, that was the one people focused on because they thought their houses were being destroyed, which is not how zoning works. Zoning is what is legal. It is not automatically what happens. My house could be torn down and turned into a triplex, but it's my house. I don't have to do that. Nobody's going to take my house away. But the rhetoric around this truly got crazy. People said they're going to come and take your house. If we allow a future house to be, I mean, literally before the 2040 plan in the city of Minneapolis, if a duplex or a triplex burned down, there were places where you could not build a duplex or a triplex in its place. Because, and this is where race comes into it, I'll just be blatant about this because it's faster. After the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968, a lot of cities around the country decided, oh, okay, well, maybe we can freeze current patterns of living, segregated patterns of living, in place by downzoning, which in effect freezes current land forms in place. Well, that happened all around the country. We have not been building more housing in cities for decades. If you're wondering why the price of housing is taking a greater and greater share of people's incomes over the past 5 decades, there's a pretty clear line of where that happened. So coming back to the 2040 lawsuit.
Can I just add one piece to that too?
Yeah.
Especially for a place in which we sometimes have to keep 100 Fahrenheit degrees above the outdoor temperature.
Yeah.
Usually with single zone, like our housing stock is so old, many houses have one thermostat. People have an incredible number of square feet per person, because especially in a city like St. Paul, the birth rates are so much lower than the housing stock was built for.
Yep.
So people live in these ridiculously large houses that they legally can't turn into like a co-op with 3 different floors and 3 different families living.
That's a great point. It shows just how far out of our way we were willing to go, we, broadly speaking, to freeze development of cities in place, because it had to be imposed upon the market. It wasn't the market. People wanted more housing. And we know this because when we do open it up and we legalize housing, housing gets built.
Yeah, I just want to give an example from Boulder where we have, it's a city that prides itself on a certain kind of environmentalism, but we have a lot of green space. People don't want to build there. A lot of people have to drive in. We can't get a light rail because of private property. And we have an ordinance that says more than 3 unrelated people can't live in one house. And you try, and people are like, it'll affect our quality of life, right?
Yep.
Which is great. It's a racially,
Absolutely.
race class, it's all there.
This reporter I was asked, that was talking to me this weekend, who wants to, I mean, she was asking me, why do people oppose density? And the honest answer is, it is a whole spectrum of good faith to bad faith concerns, from a very understandable human reaction. I moved into this neighborhood with houses the size of my house, and people don't like change. They want it to look the way it does. But that spectrum goes the whole way. I have been in conversations where somebody said to me to my face, I don't want that rail line, this was the Southwest LRT line, coming to my suburb because more, I'm not going to use all these terms, more people of color are going to move into the city. And I don't want more people of color in the city of Hopkins. We have the right balance right now. It was like, wow. I mean, just said it to me. And in that mix, at the very least, we need to be in that debate with the facts that say, if you don't let any building up, you are forcing people to build out. There's this horrible phrase, drive-til-you-qualify. Have you ever heard it? They don't use it as much in here, but it's like, well, I can't afford a house in Richfield. I can't afford a house in Bloomington. I can't afford a house in Burnsville. So I'll drive until I qualify for a mortgage. Drive till you qualify. That's what it means. Well, that's crazy. And again, if you don't let them live somewhere in a developed area, they're going to have to live in an undeveloped area. Does that mean that Minneapolis has to become Manhattan? No. Does that mean that suburbs have to become like Minneapolis? No. We do all need to do our part. And we used to make these decisions regionally through the Metropolitan Council, but not doing that. And so we are left with not even dealing with the population within the state of Minnesota, where people continue to move off farms into the city, not even thinking about migration, future climate and migration within the country, let alone the third level, which is what you were bringing to, which is there's going to be inter-country, international climate migration in the future. And some people are really sticking their heads in the sand about that.
Can I add one more
Yeah.
geography point here too? Because work Brenda Kazar did after the mortgage crisis in 2008 showed in those drive-til-you-qualify areas, the fragility to mortgage pressure was massive. Because
Yes.
all of the houses tend to be at the same price point, and there tends to be in places like there tends to be a pressure, especially in people whose employment, like the ability to have your boss come to your house and impress them,
Yep.
figures into class mobility. So you have whole municipalities where all the houses, 15 years ago, but were in the $400,000 range, and all of those foreclosed.
Yep.
Whereas within districts where there's much more diversity in housing, they were much more resilient because people were less likely to be overextended.
That's right. And it's in the movie The Big Short, if you want to see it. It's really evident there. It's those $400,000 homes, at the far reaches. And there's an equivalent with commercial property too. It turns out that those old classic main streets with a bunch of small shops are far more resilient than the big box store, because when the big box store goes away, the number of other potential users of that building are so limited, as opposed to like all throughout Minneapolis, all those little yoga studios, and they were all corner grocery stores at one point. And most of them still have businesses in them. The small and the compact and the older style of urbanism is much more resilient on a commercial level as well as a residential level.
And it also faces systemic racism, in which people say, we don't want this here because it seems cluttered to us.
Yep, absolutely.
And everything belongs.
You asked a question earlier and we didn't come back around to it. I didn't want to lose it.
No, I mean, I was making a comment about CCUS and then just sort of saying rather than carrots and sticks, I really just think markets create more opportunity for some people to have the property rights to live
Yes.
with others, and that, even some right-wing economists will say this is more efficient to do a tax. It's more about the politics. So.
Absolutely. You asked a question about this earlier, and I didn't want to lose the thread in between the two of you. I had a very conservative grandfather who read Milton Friedman, and we would have these kind of conversations. And thinking about where the climate discussion was like 15, 20 years ago, there was very much a conversation that said we shouldn't pick winners and losers. We should have a tool, a market-based tool, a carbon tax, which again, don't pick winners and losers, because that'd be awful, as if we don't do that all the time. By the way, we do that all the time. But the idea behind the carbon tax is it would be this tool that would let the market figure out the most efficient way if you just put a tax on pollution. But separate from, and by the way, I would love to both have a carbon tax and have an Inflation Reduction Act package of incentives. That would be great. But I think there was a really important, maybe underreported story from a few years ago. Greenpeace, God love them. Their tactics are beyond what Sierra Club does, but they got onto the phone. They got onto a Zoom call with two lobbyists who lobbied for oil companies. And they managed to convince these two lobbyists for oil companies, lobbying firms, big companies that did PR and all kinds of things, that they were potential new clients. Like they were posing as oil companies. And they got these two guys, one of them in particular, I'll find this for you and I'll email it. This guy said, oh yeah, we're for carbon capture, he said. He said, but let me be clear. We're for carbon capture because, not carbon capture. We're for a carbon tax. But here's the trick. We're for a carbon tax because we know it's never going to happen. we have to be for something. But it's really convenient to be for something that you know is never going to happen, so it's not actually a threat. And to be clear, he was reading the politics of that time correctly. He knew, and the oil companies knew, that getting on a website where they talked about the value of these, market-based tools, which, et cetera, they knew it was valuable for them reputationally within Washington, D.C. to claim they were for something. And claiming they were for something that they knew was never, ever going to happen was a very safe space to be. They were terrified that we would let go of their neoliberal economics and actually just say, you know what, we are going to pick winners and losers. We're going to subsidize people who do good things, which is what the Inflation Reduction Act. Politically, the Inflation Reduction Act package, that approach, was always far more likely to pass, because you create a constituency that will, first of all, it's not a tax. Number one, they knew a tax was incredibly unpopular. That cannot be overstated what a big deal that is. And think about what the Inflation Reduction Act did. It taxed corporations and tax cheats and used that money to pay for it. So if you're not a corporation, you're not a tax cheat, it's not harming you. Whereas they were ready to do, and they did with Waxman-Markey all those years ago, they did all those scare taxes. The carbon tax is a tax on you because the Democrats think you're a polluter, right? That was their message. So they were reading the politics of that time correctly. And I think collectively, people learned from that and said, you know what, we're going to let go of their dynamic. We're not going to tax people, and we're not going to let them say that. We're going to tax the wealthy. We're going to tax corporations. We're going to tax cheats. We're going to fund directly air source heat pumps and electrification and solar and wind. Now, I want to be clear. I don't think the Inflation Reduction Act is perfect. The biofuel stuff in the Inflation Reduction Act is very, very flawed. But as a package, I think it was always more politically possible to start with a package that doesn't include a tax, that is just a ton, and it's huge how big it is, a ton of carrots. And frankly, that will make it more possible once we have big solar industry, big wind industry, big electric grid that can handle it all, big EV grid. Then a few years down the line, I think a carbon tax actually is going to become a politically viable layer to put on top of it. But at the time, I think they were snowing us. I think this guy, the Greenpeace, God bless him for exposing that. He literally said, we are for it because it will never happen.
I just wanted to clarify. I mean, you mentioned carbon. I think you mentioned carbon markets.
I meant carbon market.
Those are different.
Yes, I was referring to carbon tax. You asked about carbon tax and carbon markets, and I do want to distinguish between the two. I was referring to the carbon tax. I'm talking too fast.
I'm just saying carbon markets are really problematic.
Yes.
Compared to a carbon tax.
Yes, thank you. Talking too fast. Carbon tax, everything I just said was in reference to carbon tax. Carbon markets are problematic in a different way. And actually, Joe Rahm, who I showed you that picture of, the one who said net zero is zero, there's no free lunch, that was basically what his warning was. He said carbon markets are ready for a crash because all of these big institutions, Microsoft and everything, they've all invested in this idea that isn't real. What happens when their shareholders start to hold them accountable for it being real?
I mean, the European carbon market has like carbon has almost no value. Like that's one reason. But the other is that there's additionality issues, there's issues, there's reverse incentives, and yeah. So I just wanted to.
Please check out this podcast. I can email that one to you too. Joe Rahm says the problem with carbon credits is that neither the buyer nor a seller has an incentive for them to be real. The buyer wants themselves to look good and to be, but at a cheap price, so they don't mind it being cheap. And the seller doesn't mind it being cheap either because they just want to sell a huge number of them. The buyer doesn't mind them being cheap, and the seller doesn't mind them being fake.
Okay. Can I ask?
Yeah.
What is a carbon market?
I think I should let you answer. I don't
Well,
pretend
it's
this
a
is.
price on carbon, right? And so we have voluntary markets. We don't have like a forced market. But if you offsets are a form of carbon market. Like you can say, I'm going to fly in this plane, but I'm going to plant some trees, and that's going to offset. But there is a lot of, there's a lot of cases with reducing deforestation, where, a big company might go and buy up indigenous land or displace people and then say that they're sequestering carbon. Or they might cut down some trees and then plant and say, oh, look, and so.
Or they even say, these were trees that were going to be cut down and we
exactly.
prevented it.
Right.
So you're paying for the absence of something, the absence of them being cut down.
Yeah,
I mean,
probably
talk about,
isn't
so
true.
it's like the carbon offsets.
Yeah. That's
exactly
right.
it's the climate equivalent.
Like in Minnesota right now, there's a ton of agriculture. Like this year marked kind of the beginning of a whole new wave of carbon contracts for farmers, which is like basically somehow magically with science we haven't had yet, we're going to determine that you've secured all this carbon in here. So
The
like,
peatlands too.
yeah. So people are putting a lot of investment into this, and it's unclear whether they'll be paid. Because how will it be adjudicated? It's not easy.
Oh, and the equity questions are rampant. I mean, the idea was that corporations who really could just reduce their own emissions would rather more cheaply buy carbon credits from developing countries to theoretically help them reduce their emissions. But as Joe Rahm points out in his podcast, even if that theoretically made sense, before we recognize we got to zero, once we know that the IPC goal is to get to zero, why would anybody sell anything that's real? If you're a developing country, you don't want to sell that. You want to take credit for the fact that we addressed our own emissions. And there was this famous incident where, I can't remember which country it is, but there's also double counting. I think it was Microsoft was taking credit for a set of carbon reductions in another country, but the country was also taking credit for them.
Yeah.
It's like, well, it can't be both of you, but it's an unregulated market, so it becomes voodoo. While you're thinking of other questions, I want to put other thing out there. And by all means, come up with other questions about other topics or other bills or whatever. So coming back around to our order for just a second, I'm going to come back around to the order. Can you guess why we chose with elected officials to put our 5 questions in the order that we put them in?
Maybe to de-emphasize it.
That's part of the reason. That's the most political one.
Right.
It's also for a lot of elected officials the kind of the obvious one. Well, you don't trust anybody from the oil companies, but since the dynamic is much more complicated than just oil companies, we didn't want to start with the obvious and political one.
But you also disqualify a bunch of dumb stuff with the first question.
Yes, that was a big part of it because it's unusual. I shouldn't say unusual. Yeah, it's unusual that you would have an example like ethanol where it fails all 5. Do you know what I mean? There are other examples where there's something that maybe reduces emissions compared to some other existing thing. Classic example, natural gas, right? Is natural gas better than coal? Does it reduce emissions compared to coal? Sure. Yeah. Wow, that's a low bar, but it's true, right? So we wanted to be in a position of acknowledging that and then going to the second question. But obviously, there is no such thing as, a net zero natural gas or a zero natural gas. There's no such thing as that. So ethanol is in some ways a strange example to start with. We started with it because it's kind of like a slam dunk to anybody who's paying attention. But there are other things on here that require a more elaborate conversation to separate question 1 from question 2. To acknowledge for the people who need to know that that's true, for example, that natural gas is better than coal, and then to dismiss the value of that question or to put it in context. Other questions?
So, you're talking about what is the best way to present information to people.
Yeah.
And you talked about how we do need to pay attention to these other things that may be going against what we're saying, because there are like the costs and the
Mhm.
so but like we have a history of like climate communication or science communication kind of losing in these battles of,
Yeah.
of things being disinformed or are being made bigger out of proportion to what the actual problem is.
Yeah.
With your work where you have to communicate these ideas, like how do you figure out what the right balance of like being like, this is the important talking point, we need to pay attention to these other things, but this is the important part without like while
Yeah.
still telling the truth. Like it's
Yeah, there is no simple answer to that one, I tell you. I mean, have you heard the phrase elevator speech?
elevator pitch, yeah.
An elevator pitch, what can you say in the context of an elevator? 90 seconds or whatever. Boy, at the legislature, you've got to have a 1-minute version, a 2-minute version, a 1-line version, a 1-minute version, a 2-minute version, a 5-minute version. And it's rare that you get like we actually got to talk about this for 90 minutes, not during the legislature with a bunch of legislators at the same time. Rare opportunity, points to the folks who are willing to sit down for that in a job that's seasonal, which is a legislative job. I find a couple of things that are helpful. One is having multiple versions. 2 is, and other groups don't do this, and I think Sierra Club and our more effective partners do this, is knowing when to be strictly factual and when to question motivation. There's plenty of research which indicates that if somebody believes something that is inaccurate, you cannot assume you're going to persuade them with facts. If you can't get them to question the motivation of the person who told them the inaccurate information in the first place, they're unlikely to change their minds. Frankly, at the Capitol, a lot of people aren't willing to change their minds generally. 99% of my communications are with Democrats who are interested in hearing from me. And 90% of my work with coalitions is getting them to appreciate that that is the nature of the work. God bless the people who, Citizens Climate Lobby or whoever wants to beat their heads against the wall, convincing people who got elected on the basis of climate denial to change their minds. I don't think that's a good use of our time. So those are a couple of things I do. Another thing I learned when I was in college was people make decisions more on the basis of risk avoidance rather than benefit accrual. There's social science behind that, and that's how they described it when I was in college. And boy, have I found that to be the case. If you just say, this is good, you're not really turning up the dial on folks. And particularly in the context of something as urgent as the climate crisis, you need to talk about the cost of inaction and then compare the action to the cost of inaction. So you need to, and not just in big ways, but in little ways, you need to make sure that to identify a threat to progress and the need to prevent that threat. And that needs to be balanced with not just being overly negative. Because frankly, despair, hopelessness is a weapon of big oil and big ag, particularly big oil, because they've just been at this longer and they have perfected. Look at Amy Westervelt's podcast. Wow. Season 1, season 3, drilled. Wow. I mean, when you appreciate that they have been doing propaganda for 75 years, well, they got good at it for a reason. And there's kind of a natural, forget I said that. There is a sequence that I've noticed, a pattern that has been noticed by environmentalists in terms of the arguments of the other side. They start with minimization and then denial. And then but at some point when they have to admit that something is real, then they move to false solutions, right? Citizens United actually changed the order. It actually brought the whole nation backwards in time. If you look at the Republican elected officials, George W. Bush, John McCain, even Mitt Romney, it wasn't that long ago where they were admitting that climate change was real. And then Citizens United happened, and from my perspective, big oil is like, wow, why buy politicians retail? Let's buy wholesale. Let's buy in bulk. Let's buy the entire debate. And they regressed to it isn't real. It isn't happening. And we spent a decade dealing with just blatant climate denial. They would love to go back to false solutions. And that's frankly part of the reason that Sierra Club and our friends are doing what we're doing, because we don't have time to go through this cycle multiple times. And as Amy Westervelt points on her podcast, they are willing to just bounce back and forth randomly between denial, minimization. It's real, but it doesn't matter. It's real, but it's natural. It's not real. I mean, there's no coherent logic. They just
throw everything at the wall and see what sticks.
That's right. And David Roberts, amongst others who had this podcast, has pointed out that the media is so desperate to both sides things that when they start, there are younger climate problematic, climate bad politicians on the other side of this debate who recognize that they're losing young Republican voters. And are they moving to climate action? No, they're moving from climate denial to false solutions. Matt Gaetz has been telling Kevin McCarthy, you need to have a climate plan. So they put together a climate plan. And if you're a reporter, you look at the climate plan, you realize, oh, the climate plan makes emissions worse. It's not actually a climate plan. But that's not the point. The point is on the cover, it says climate plan, right? So I think it's really incumbent upon us to get there first, to describe what's real and what's fake. So when they inevitably get to the point of moving away from denial because they're losing too many young Republican voters, losing too many suburban swing voters, and they switch to false solutions, we've already told people, no, don't fall for this. You know what's real. Electrification is real, et cetera, what we talked about. But again, despair and hopelessness is a weapon of the other side. They are happy to switch from climate denial randomly to, yeah, it's real and it's too late. There's nothing to be done about it. It's insane. And then back and forth. And so we always try and start with reminding people, oh my God, there's such good news. Stuff that I dreamed about 15 years ago is happening. So hope is a weapon against them, and despair is their weapon against us.
Thank you so much. So speaking of hope, what can we look forward to in the next legislative session?
Yeah, a bunch of things. So one of them is, working on this land use issue. Let me say one hopeful thing about the land use issue. Actually, that is an issue which has been bipartisan in other states. Not just it's happened with bipartisan support in Washington and Oregon, but Montana did this because there's this phenomenon where, and I'm going to give you kind of the uniting value. People should be able to afford to live in the communities they grow up in. And you can talk to an older voter and say, don't you think your kids should be able to live near you? Why is it that they can't afford to live near you? I haven't had a chance at Sierra Club because I've been working on things that are partisanized like transit and solar and wind to work on an issue that's bipartisan. And those conversations are just beginning now. I don't think it's going to happen all in one session of the legislature, but I'm encouraged by what I've seen in other states that Republicans, especially from rural communities, not high wealth communities, have been a part of at least some of those bills. So that's one point. There's going to be a lot of work on implementation, IRA implementation. There's going to be hearings at the legislature looking at some of the sticks. Remember, we talked about Inflation Reduction Act is a lot of carrots. Give you a perfect example. My parents got a flyer. My parents still get bills by mail. I don't get them by email, or they get them by mail. And a lot of older people get their bills in the mail. They got their gas bill. It's pretty small now because my parents have converted all their appliances to electricity. They have a gas backup to their electric air source heat pump water heater. But this was a couple of years ago before they had that. And CenterPoint Energy sent them a little flyer in the mail saying that gas water heaters were better for climate. This is a publicly regulated utility. They should not, they're using ratepayer dollars, your dollars, Hamlin's dollars paying to heat your dorms. They are paying with ratepayer dollars to lie to you. There is no place in Minnesota where, electric air source heat pumps are not just less polluting because they're electric, just like with electric cars, they're less polluting because they're less polluting. Did I say that right? Less polluting because they're so much more efficient. There is no place in Minnesota where a gas water heater is more efficient. They should not be allowed to lie to ratepayers, a publicly regulated utility. I think we should have hearings on that. We could create incentives for people to switch out their gas appliances to electric appliances. And maybe the first step to that is forbidding them from having, I remember a couple of years ago, so who's from Colorado? Okay, so it's funny. Excel is in both Colorado and Minnesota. And I remember when I was looking to switch my gas water heater to an electric air source heat pump water heater. And in Colorado, you could get a rebate for either kind. And I was on the phone with somebody from Excel and they were like, oh, I'm so excited to be able to tell you about this. And she said, what's your zip code? And I gave her my zip code and she said, oh, I'm sorry, you're from Minnesota. We don't have that available in Minnesota. So in Colorado, you could get the rebate for a better appliance, but in Minnesota, you could only get the rebate for the equally polluting appliance. Well, the legislature can end that. This is a publicly regulated utility. So those are a couple of examples.
It was really interesting when I was getting a water heater. The plumbers didn't want to do it, and all the companies tried to talk me out of it. Like, oh, they don't work in this climate. Oh, it's such a pain. Yeah, so there's many barriers.
Oh, believe me, thank you so much for bringing that up, because that's another one. So there's this organization that Sierra Club is a part of nationally called the Blue-Green Alliance. Blue for unions, green for environmentalists. Sierra Club and the Steelworkers were nationally part of putting that together, and we have our own local chapter here. There are things we don't agree on, but one of the things we've been talking about is how do we take advantage of all this Inflation Reduction Act money? How do we look into contract agglomeration? I think that's what it's called, because are we really bidding out each individual house? Are we really making each individual homeowner have to feel like a general contractor, like my parents did, like I did? I'm going to call the electrician, and the electrician has to, but the plumber has to come first to unhook, but then the electric appliance has to be ready to go. And it's like, if it's going to be that level of hassle, a lot of people aren't going to do it. And you're going to run into those. I ran into those contractors. And can we work with the unions to get people dual certified so one contractor can come to your house to do both things? And what's better is for low-income housing, can we group a bunch together so it's not only one contractor, but it's one union contractor getting good wages to do one section of housing and then move on low-income housing within a particular low-income neighborhood and then move on to another one? There's got to be ways to speed this up and make sure it's got good union wage jobs.
And then there's this awesome additional layer, because Asian Economic Development Association here has been doing projects addressing racism in the trades, and
yes,
basically doing trainings both on the hiring side and also coaching on here's how you get certified to get into these unions, because people aren't necessarily looking for electricians. That's
totally true. I mean, if you have young people who are not friends who are not interested in or college bound, the number of electricians that are going to get hired in this country in the next 20 years are incredible. And unions are a crucial part of making sure that job development happens and that it become more equitable. And some unions have been doing this really well for a long time. And some unions will admit to you that they are not as good at it. Like SEIU, the Service Workers International, they are a multicultural union. They at their meetings, they speak multiple languages and they're very inclusive. There are other unions that I'm not going to name, but have struggled more with that. But they have brothers and sisters within the labor movement who they can turn to say, hey, if we want to get better at this, how do we get better at this? That is going to be part of the future, being blue, green, and equitable. What are you guys going to do? Tell me what you're going to do next. It's 8 o'clock. You can stop the video if you want to, but I want to know what you're interested in if you have like a minute or two more. We're at the end, right? What are you interested in?
Oh, I got just through that. Okay. I am interested in, well, this is my sophomore year, but I've always loved science and STEM, and so I've always planned on going into that. But then I've also really cared about the environment for a long time, and so it was climate science for a while, and then now I'm concentrating in public policy for environmental studies, because if you care about the environment, you start to care about the policy, because you're bringing things to a larger scale, and you're seeing a bunch of things in climate science that aren't translating well over to public policy. So so I guess that kind of sector, bridging that gap, is what I'm interested in right now. When
legislators find scientists they can rely on, it's like they discovered gold. My mother was a legislator for 34 years, and at different points in her career was chair of transportation, energy, and environment. Transportation, environment, and then energy. She ended on energy. And they need it. They need to hear from scientists and people with scientific backgrounds, people who have multidisciplinary backgrounds. They need to hear that. So whatever you end up doing, I mean, my brother got his undergrad in biology, his PhD from the university in environmental biology. He got his BA in physics and then environmental biology, and he has like 12 to 14 undergrads at his prairie restoration site every summer for the past 20 years. And I get to talk public policy with them and like plant the seed. You can do both. You can do both.
Boy, what a hard question. I guess one thing that I've recently kind of become interested in that kind of aligns with a lot of my views and kind of what I want to do is the conservation of native plants and also the knowledge of it, and how we can use that to also possibly break free from the current food system that we have. So kind of moving away from large corporation providing our nutrition and coming back to our community providing our nutrition.
Love it. You should look at Echinacea Project. Maybe some summer in the next couple of summers, you might want to go to northern Minnesota, because it's all about native plants. But the food system part of that, if my wife were here, she'd be like, woo! I mean, that's needed too. And it's all intersected. Public health, the health of soil, isn't it connected? The health of the soils to the health of the human microbiome. I mean, it's all connected. Very cool.
I am currently doing research on climate change communication, looking at like what emotions and messages work best to mobilize action. And I'm also interested in policy, looking at some students looking at different grad schools for environmental policy and energy.
Awesome. Have you looked at the Yale School of Climate Communications?
Yes.
One of my favorite things on there is they have the 5 Americas thing.
So I'm using that in my research. Yeah.
I love using the 5 Americas with legislators, by the way. There's a lot of their stuff that is what I love is that they have dense and non-dense versions of their stuff.
Right.
And the 5 Americas was so useful when we were plotting over the summer, this first session, the one that you just saw, because I said right up front, we're here for the first 2 Americas.
Right.
This is not about persuading, and there are other forums where we need to persuade people, but just persuading the group of, what is the top 2? The alarmed and concerned, which has grown by 12% or whatever over the past 14%, getting that group to do this, that's the perfect example of what you were talking about before with Annie. We don't need to persuade everybody. But if we can arm that group with this, oof, we can do a lot. So, well, that's great. This is all great. I got one more. Can you tell me what you want to do? You don't have to. This is not on the test. Okay.
We're really grateful that you parked here and helped facilitate making this work.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
so much, especially for communicating to our remote audience. So, thank you so much for taking the time
You bet.
to do this. As you can see, this audience is really engaged, and I'm really lucky to get to work with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for connecting. Tomorrow we're going to be talking. We've been working with Catherine Wagenius, who's with Isaiah and
Oh, okay.
the Young Adult Coalition.
Okay.
So really,
What's the last name again?
Wagenius.
Okay. I've interacted with other people at Isaiah.
I think she's been there the last year and is really working with the St. Paul young people's engagement, hyper local politics to get climate action plan,
Mm-hmm.
but basically to get St. Paul politics more aligned to intro climate.
Yeah.
So it's been super fun to work with her.
Well, that's great.
Talk to her.
Isaiah was a crucial part of our, like, if there were like 5 organizations that were essential to passing the transportation bill, Isaiah was one of them. And they will hopefully be a part of our land use efforts too. So.
Well, and just thank you so much. I feel like even more than some of the specifics of what got passed, seeing how the communication strategies are working and how people are thinking is really, as you said, pulling that group back. So
Great.
thank you so much.
Good stuff. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming. I know it was a logistical challenge. And we're
Yes,
doing it.
I'm glad we all connected, so you knew I was going to be here.